Hello, welcome to part 2 of the complexity model of gender explained. In this video, I will focus on the integrative ecological model. The complexity model of gender shown here was developed to address some of the limitations of existing theories that were briefly discussed in the previous video. As you can see, the model includes several interconnected elements, but we'll explore each of them step by step, beginning with part A, the integrative ecological model. As a reminder, throughout these slides, the butterfly images represent the developing person, and the flowers represent the context in which development occurs, two elements that are always present, even when not explicitly discussed. Let's start with part A, the Integrative Ecological Model. If you're familiar with Bronfenbrenner's work, you'll recognize that this model is really an adaptation of his ecological systems theory. The basic idea is straightforward. At the center is a developing person, and surrounding that person are a series of nested contextual systems that influence development. Bronfenbrenner used terms such as microsystem and mesosystem to describe these different layers of context. In the next few sections, I'll walk through each of these systems and highlight the modifications I've made. Most of these changes are not departures from Bronfenbrenner's original model, so much as amplifications of ideas that were already present, at least implicitly. To better understand gender development, I found it useful to make certain aspects of the model more visible and explicit, to turn the volume up on features that are especially relevant to gender. So let's begin at the center, the developing person. All right, so let's start at the center with the developing person. Here, what I am highlighting and kind of turning the volume up on is that the developing person is not only a biological human being, developing person, which Bronfenbrenner emphasized, especially when he renamed the model bioecological, but it's also a cognitive person, right? That we have a mind and we have three domains of development. We have biological, cognitive, and social. All these contextual systems, environmental concentric circles are representing the social aspects of development. That domain is covered by looking at those outer circles, and the biological is, part of the person, and then, even talked about by Bronfenbrenner in his revision of the model. But something that sometimes can get a little lost is the cognitive person there, the person's mind, the thinking. And one reason why that's really important when we're talking about gender and dimensions like gender identity is that identity is an interior cognitive experience or construct. So it's important to highlight. All right, and then speaking of identities, in order to understand any identity, we must understand that identities are intersectional, that they interact and that they overlap, and that we can't separate each part of ourself. So, if I am a woman and a heterosexual, able-bodied, white, maybe middle class, things like that, those are all working together in an interactive, intersectional way. In the background there, you have a picture of a kaleidoscope, which can be an interesting metaphor for intersectional identities that describes identities as each turn of the kaleidoscope producing a different picture where no single image dominates, and that they're all just kind of part of this collective collage kaleidoscope, beautiful mess of who we are. Now, intersectional identities are also going to position us to have some privileges and some oppressions. And some people are going to have all privileges, some people are going to have all oppressions, and some people have a mix. So, for example, in a patriarchal society, men have more power and more privilege than women. Here you can see the developmental context that's also listed as an individual level of the developing person. So Bronfenbrenner's theory is a developmental theory, so a lot of this is implicit in his theory, and I'm just making it explicit. So to understand the developmental context, it can be helpful to highlight, for example, the role of motivational orientations that correspond to developmental stages or age period. So these are just examples of developmental context. So for example, broad motivations for growth, maintenance, or loss vary across the lifespan. For example, younger people are more oriented towards growth, and older people are more oriented towards maintenance and loss prevention. We can also look at the fact that motivational orientations shift depending on future time perspective or whether one perceives time as unlimited, which is relatively more characteristic of younger people versus more limited, which is more characteristic of older people. Developmental life tasks are another part of the developmental context. For example, some life tasks typically occur in culturally specific ways at specific ages. Tasks that are currently typical of US adolescents in the early stages of adulthood, like emerging adulthood, include obtaining an education, exploring one's identity, and the primacy of intimate relationships. Whereas other developmental tasks typically take priority at later stages of adulthood, such as the crunch of establishing a career and family in established adulthood, or later adulthood developmental tasks might include caregiving and maintaining one's health. So these are just a few examples to give you an idea of what I mean when I say the developmental context. That yes, of course, we're talking about just, being a young person versus being an older person and those developmental domains that I mentioned earlier, social, cognitive, biological, but we're also talking about some more of these, like I said, kind of broad orientations that relate to or vary by development. Although Bronfenbrenner's model is contextual, that is almost the point, the immediate microsystems in the model, such as home and work, are broadly considered without much detail. Detailed factors in the immediate context, such as who's involved in a microsystem, like friends, colleagues, people who are same versus other or integrated, gender or sex, also impact our gender development. From a social contextual approach to gender, gender expression is dynamic or context dependent rather than stable across context. So rather than being trait-like, it is state-like is another way to say that. From this perspective, gender is expressed to meet the demands of the immediate context. So by breaking the microsystem down into two parts, the immediate versus broad microsystems, it provides an opportunity to highlight this important developmental work, looking at the interaction of the individual and factors and the contextual factors on aspects of gender, like doing gender or what we might call gender expression. Here you can just see some examples of immediate microsystems, same gender or mixed gender groups hanging out socially or working together. So now moving on to the broader microsystem, which is just borrowing from Bronfenbrenner's model exactly as it is. This system includes settings and contexts that are part of a person's life, such as geographic locations, cities versus rural settings, as well as home, school, social gathering places. It's also worth noting that more and more of these spaces might occur in online or what you might call the metaverse. And notice that all of these broad microsystems would vary depending on the more specific or immediate context, such as the ones we just discussed. Unlike the more immediate systems, the ecosystem does not include or directly involve the developing person per se, but it impacts them nonetheless. This system comprises formal and informal structures, including government, health and welfare services, educational systems, and mass media. Other examples include patterns of social and recreational life, systems of mass communication, and law enforcement practices. The ecosystem is not discussed much as we apply the complexity model of gender to understand gender identity and expression. However, they are important context to acknowledge. This system is very consequential regarding privilege, equity, and positionality because this system follows the macro system, which can provides the blueprint or the values, the broad social cultural values. And those who do not fit with those broad cultural norms and values can experience a great deal of oppression in the context of the ecosystem. All right, and then the macro system, again, very just consistent with how Bronfenbrenner explained it. Like the ecosystem, it does not explicitly include or directly involve the developing person. It comprises broad ideologies and beliefs such as capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, all of which influence the developing person via more immediate contexts, like the microsystems. People are often unaware of these structural forces, especially those who conform to them. These ideologies, including systems promoting hyper-gender norms or like strict gender norms, or a binary view of gender, or beliefs in inherent, like biologically based male-female differences, all of those serve as blueprints for the immediate systems. So all systems within the macro system align with its dominant ideologies. Now the chronosystem is also shown here, was shown on every slide. It refers to the socio-historical influences of human development. For instance, the second wave of the 60s and 70s feminist movement is defined in part by transformation in women's, especially white women's, entrance into the workforce and ecosystem. During this era, historical events related to legislation that advanced women's rights in the workplace, like the Equal Pay Act, led to women's increased participation in the workforce. The chronosystem is also an essential element of a feminist approach. It highlights that as the socio-historical context changes, so can the other systems. Macro systems contain the dominant ideology that trickles down to influence each other level. As time progresses, social justice and feminist efforts can work for social change at all the levels. Or maybe that is too optimistic. We can hope, we can hope. All right, also acknowledging that development is lifelong is represented on the model by the next to the chronosystem there, the word lifespan with the arrow. The lifespan developmental psychology theoretical perspective is complex in its own right. I'm not going to go over it in full detail here. I guess the thing to note here is that development is lifelong, and that is inclusive of all ages, all age periods, and that is consistent with a feminist approach to psychology to not just focus on children, but also, for example, older women who are often forgotten. So, yeah, that is good. So that was part A, and now we'll be on to part B, the multidimensional model, which is the topic of the third and final video in this series.